Welcome. This is Leonard Lee, Managing Director of neXt, and thank you for joining today's Rethink Webcast. And in this session, we will be discussing digital reinvention with special panelists from IBM. For those of you who are not familiar with neXt, let me introduce you to our firm very quickly here. We are a San Diego-based boutique consulting and research firm focused on providing experience-based advisory services to inspire our clients' digital future. And we advise across a wide range of digital topics, drawing from the expertise and experience of our executive consultants and analysts. And today, we are very honored to be joined by some good friends from IBM who have been kind enough to participate in a panel discussion with neXt. Christine, Scott, Riza, would you kindly introduce yourselves and share briefly your fascinating background?
Sure. This is Christine Gonzalez-Wirtz, and I am the electronics leader for IBM's Institute for Business Value. While everybody knows about IBM Research, on the flip side, we have a business strategy-oriented group that is dedicated specifically to help define the future for our clients from a business perspective. I work on technology and trends and strategic positioning in AI, analytics, IoT, security, data, and customer experience, specifically going deep and understanding how we're going to help our clients move toward future ways of creating new experiences and, in fact, creating new monetization strategies.
Hi, this is Scott Burnett. I'm the Global Director for our Business Development and overall business for electronics industry. I hail outside of IBM, going back to a career in the media and entertainment industry from Disney and Warner. Started up with one of the first internet music companies called Liquid Audio. We went IPO in '99, and I have this career here with IBM on blazing the path of services and digital transformation of companies. I've kind of been on that path for a number of years across different industries, but it's interesting to note the convergence. And I find myself in the boardroom of companies, much like Reza and Christine, dealing with the strategic elements as well as the transformational elements in the company, bridging market dynamic. I also sit on the board of the Consumer Technology Association, which is the bellwether, the governing association for what we all know as CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, and all the other activities. I sit on the board of trustees of the foundation as well, which is dedicated to bridging the life and enhancing the life of aging and disabilities with new technologies. So delighted to be here this morning, and I'll turn the mic over to Reza.
Thank you, Scott. My name is Reza Firuzbak. I'm a partner in IBM's Global Business Services Division, which is the consulting division of IBM. And I run a consulting practice called Digital Strategy for the industrial sector. I've been a strategy consultant my entire career, about 25 years. It's also been an interesting career in the sense I've taken a lot of detours during that time. And I started out my career in the life sciences industry and biotech and medical devices. And over the last 10 to 12 years or so, I've been focused primarily in electronics and high tech. Currently, I'm working with clients undergoing significant digital reinvention, which is, of course, the topic of today's discussion. Happy to be here.
It's really fantastic, the three of you joining us. We're really excited to have what I anticipate is going to be a very vibrant discussion on the topic of digital reinvention. I'm also pleased to introduce neXt principal and panelists, Jody Starkman, Akshay Sharma, and Dean Freeman. Jody is a principal with neXt, and she brings more than 30 years of experience leading and managing transformation initiatives with Fortune companies. And she has worked with leading advisory firms such as PwC and IBM. And as an executive consultant, she is currently focused on the future of work, organizations and people, and leadership. And Akshay Sharma is a renowned industry analyst and consultant who has worked with some of the leading tech firms and was a research director with Gartner, Inc. for 10 years. And as a principal with neXt, Akshay covers various domains, including blockchain, network and data center technologies, IoT communication, security, and telecom digital transformation. Dean is also a renowned tech analyst with a distinguished 17-year career with Gartner as a research vice president with the semiconductor group. Dean's research focus was on the semiconductor forecast and leading the Internet of Things Center of Excellence. Let's get started with the IBM Institute of Business Value. Christine, can you share with the audience what the IBM IBV is?
IBM Institute for Business Value is less known. The assets we produce are extensively known. We've just launched the 19th edition of the Global C-Suite Study, which is a landmark transformational study focused on executives and across the portfolio, whether it's the CEO, CIO, CFO, CMO, into very deep perspectives on what's changing. And we also run research agendas for each of the 17 separate industries, but also specific domains, whether that is on strategy or IoT, whether that is on security or blockchain. We produce very detailed introspective documents that allow perspective to be developed and shared with our clients to have this sort of higher level conversation to help them shape their future. Digging down one level, when we look at this concept for today's conversation about using data by design, what we're talking about is powering next-gen electronics companies and making this shift to digital reinvention. And digital reinvention is different than digital transformation. So there's been an awful lot of talk about this transformation that we go through as part of this process. But reinvention is fundamentally different in the sense that what it does is put forward the premise that you're going from actually digitizing your assets into creating new ways of looking at the way you use them across your enterprise. So before, when you started to look at this process of making things more accessible to the digitization process, to actually connecting them across your enterprise and elevating that customer experience, digital reinvention actually begins to ask you to posit new approaches and new ways of looking at not just the data that you have, but looking at how that can completely redefine all of the interactions you have in a company. And that's not just data you own, it's data you can access or bring in from the outside. So you have to begin to change to what kind of questions do you want to answer, and how will those influence the way you design products, the way you design solutions or offerings, and the way you package them up into long tail customer experiences. So not just the initial purchase of something, but the creation of a very deep, lifelong set of interactions with customers and creating that way of monetizing that back part that goes far beyond that initial interaction. So when we looked at this concept around the evolution of digital, what we find is that there are these dramatic forces that are causing a shift. And we look, 76% of executives who we spoke to were actually citing market factors as the challenge that they have moving forward. And that, for once in many years, exceeded technology, where technology came in at 73%. So it's not just this change in technology that's happening. It's this change in the forces in the market that are driving this. As you heard from Scott, when he mentioned that there's this industry blurring of boundaries where telco and what's going on with 5G will influence so much of what we see in the experience pieces going forward, where IoT and the ability to collect data at a point is coming in and bringing change, whether that data is collected in a car but used by an insurer, or whether you start to see with our electronics devices these interactions that happen that cause all of the industries to blur. And 72% of our executives said that was a challenge for them. But at the same time, when you start to look at this reinvention process, you find that not just the creation of what you're doing today is what matters, but the ability to actually shift your business model. And when we had asked this question in the last C-Suite study, we found that 17% had expected that they would be in new business models. When we look at it this time, 41%. So 2.5 times as many are actually looking at ways to completely use data by design to create new means of interacting with customers and creating those lifelong experiences, insights, and abilities to leverage that data across their entire business ecosystem and universe at large.
Christine, let me ask the IBM folks this. In the white paper, you mentioned the everyone to everyone economy. How does that fit into what you just described?
It used to be that value chains, Leonard, were very focused on sort of a linear approach. Reza and I were just having a conversation before this on the sense that the complexity in that is now exponential, where you have the opportunity for the data you collect, for the interactions you have, to be from multiple points in your ecosystem to your consumer, from your consumer back to an organization with data that might benefit another partner. So we have a whole lot of richness in those interactions and a whole lot of complexity that is now nonlinear and will drive to everyone's interaction with everything. So you have a much greater ability to connect those dots and to not just broker that relationship, but to enhance it and to allow that the data that is generated from that and the insight to benefit more than just those two individuals, the two individuals involved in that initial or that singular transaction.
So if I could add to what Christine said, thinking about this many-to-many question takes me back to the earlier part of my career as a biologist. In a biological context, you don't think about linear relationships, right? It's about systems. It's about a series of complex relationship between multiple parties that looks more like a network than it does a value chain. That's what's happening, right? We're going from an industrial economy where we had really optimized around this sort of linear value chain to this digital economy where it's really about ecosystems and networks where multiple parties are interacting in very different ways, changing value in different ways. And that's what really the difference between a transformation and reinvention is. A transformation is basically digitizing the traditional linear value chain, whereas a reinvention is really rethinking the business in the context of a network or an ecosystem that generates entirely new value pools, entirely new revenue models, could really recast the business model and open up many opportunities to create value in new ways, oftentimes in ways that are really even difficult to predict when one starts going down the path of reinvention. I know there was, for example, one example where a farm equipment manufacturer that started out embedding sensors in their equipment for predictive maintenance of the equipment. Over time, that data became so valuable that the financial services industry had demand for that data in order to be able to predict, crop prices and commodity prices and so forth. So entirely where they started was around how do we better maintain our equipment. Where they ended up was generating this very valuable data that had value to an entirely different industry that really wasn't even part of that value chain when they started, right? That's the many-to-many economy, right? It's these entirely new relationships that can form when you reinvent the business focused on the digital economy.
So that's a great example of, I would say, how companies go from going to the digitizing or the digital transformation and then stumbling in the digital reinvention. From my viewpoint, where I'm down with the users and looking at the endpoints, that's still the case with most companies. Christine talked about data by design, but the question still there is, what do these companies need to measure? How do they figure out what to measure? And then how do they get to that step from digital transformation into digital reinvention? Because most of them are still stuck, or as we take a look at what's going on in the IoT, most of them are just trying to go from, all right, what do I collect? How do I implement an IoT solution? And then how do I make money off of it?
Dean, if I can take that, one of the interesting ways to look at that is that we tend to look at it by user, asset, and environment data. And most of the companies that we work with tend to understand their user data really well. They are becoming more familiar with their asset data, driven by predominantly IoT. But it's that environment data that creates this extreme richness. And I'll give you an example. So the amount of elevators in a building, when you can now begin to look at, originally you understood who the owner was, you understood the asset, said elevator, but the environment is how are people being able to actually interact with that elevator? Can you detect them when they walk in by their badge, to be able to automatically understand the queuing that you need to have, that will allow you to optimize the movement of people. So instead of just having this elevator, you now have this understanding around the mobility within the building. And how do you begin to solve for those kinds of things? You also have the ability to understand when challenges with weather might occur, or you've got wear patterns, or you've got lots of different ways to be able to communicate with all of those assets more effectively. Whether you've got vehicles and you're looking at it from that perspective, or even machinery in a plant that might interact and might be prone to weather data or humidity, and bringing that in and understanding. So while we see a lot of clients have that very distinct understanding on the first two categories, it's that brand new opening up around environment data that can bring an additional richness. And it could be crime data that you bring in. It could be delivery data or delivery routes. All of these pieces that exist that can now be brought in to optimize those other two areas are what drives reinvention. And that's why we say you've got to start with the questions, not the answers. Typically, the answers are driven off of the two data sets that you're familiar with. The questions come from the outside in.
Christine was just talking about the elevators. Maybe my stomach is going to a topic area of hunger as I'm thinking about the kitchen or my home. But this element of the business of things, Leonard, you mentioned the Internet of Things. Of course, we're talking a little bit about just the on-ramp. We published some papers prior. We created this model called CORE, C-O-R-E. Connect. You got to connect the devices themselves. That's just table stakes.
Right.
So you have that whole device plane itself. But the data that is being designed in the front, which is to be something that can't necessarily be predicted. You want to predict as much of the asset and environment data as you can, but you need to keep the open door for continual iteration and reinvention along this path, or else you're going to release a product for which is then kind of cordoned off into a certain aspect of use only. And if I think about the cognitive kitchen, if you look at any of the appliance makers that we deal with on the electronics front, they've got decisions that they've got to make, not only just on the device itself and all of the feature functions that we all are familiar with, but then the extensions of that connectivity, right, in the application and the use and control plane and all of that, and then the feedback of that data to their company for new insights. But they need to anticipate the other areas of insight or services for which is really forcing a question. And Reza was talking about, from a business model perspective, I would posture, what business am I in if I'm an appliance maker and I'm releasing product for which shows up in the kitchen, for which is no longer just about cleaning dishes or keeping food cold. It's now I'm in the nutrition and I'm in the energy consumption and provisioning of the supply of what am I using as far as the operation of the device itself. I'm into the exercise and health and well-being. I'm into the extended health status of what do I eat? Well, what would be appropriate? What about for my family? Well, what about the meal planning? And, my son might be diabetic, or somebody might have a certain malady for which the food consumption and nutritional content, the freshness, and then all of the other environmental elements of air quality or food safety. Of course, that brings us into blockchain extensions down the road as well, stress and behavioral issues, and then the habits of the product itself, for which come together in this new experience of, let's call it the cognitive kitchen, for which an appliance maker finds themselves in this burgeoning ecosystem of use and value. And it's daunting. If you think about, from an engineering perspective, what technology do I put into my appliance for which can live and anticipate the future. But I know by design, the data needs to be able to flow and the new services and use cases need to be enabled. But I do need to lock down on a product design from its get-go and ship something. But I do need to anticipate the agent relationship, if you will. Every one of these devices are agents in a participative manner in this new environment of interconnectivity and the blurriness of lines that are causing stress on companies as to defining what business they are really in. Those that are thinking ahead and using data by design from the very get-go and thinking this way, I think are grabbing some early mind share, but also positioning themselves for long-term value beyond just a feature function product release mentality of old. That's where the aha opens up across the CIO and CTO and the product engineering and all the way down through, sales services and support, where everybody's got to come together in this new paradigm.
Why don't we move on to our next agenda topic, which is, and I think we touched on this a little bit based on the conversation we've had thus far, but how are businesses digitally reinventing themselves? And maybe what we can do is talk about some of the archetypical patterns. One of the things that I think will be interesting to discuss here is what are the specifics or nuances for electronics companies versus companies in other industries or other industries. Scott, you mentioned the blurring of lines, and as I listened to some of these case studies the IBM team has been surfacing around digital reinvention, the blurring of the lines really seems to be the blurring of the lines between the electronics industry and some of these other industries that the electronics industry supports or digitizes. And we heard agriculture, we heard health and fitness. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
The electronics industry is in the heart or in the core of what we see as the IoT. What are these things? These Internet of Things are the electronics companies in many cases that are making things that are inside of something else or that get packaged as part of a new experience by another industry, whether it be medical devices for which get used in either HIPAA compliant scenarios or hospital to home, or whether it be our relationship with electronics companies that are making the guts inside the connected car. And that connected car then, as far as the other elements of data, the people, asset, and environmental data that need to be, by design, put into that whole product new use scenario, for which is part of this blurring of a line of, the head-end system in a car or the media and entertainment system in a car, for which is now interrelating to all of the other elements of the performance of that vehicle in this new connected life. What we've seen is companies getting the training wheels on as far as these appliances in their own discrete manner, but then the ever complexity of these products for which find their way from the electronics manufactured perspective into a new environment for which is a new experience. And it's then going to that end use of the product itself by design that needs to be sewn together. We use a whole process called design thinking. Reza can go into great detail on that. But from the standpoint of digital reinvention, what business am I in? The product or the thing for which I'm engineering, manufacturing, designing, bringing is now to be anticipated into the new environment for which it's going to create a new experience. And it may be participating in that experience, or it may be enabling that new experience of a product plus a service combination. So, with appliances in this particular example here, if I look at going back to early days with companies like in Germany, Miele, they've had connected appliances for a decade or more. And they've been, got a lot of arrows in the back to show, blazing of trails associated with their own gateway and all kinds of things that they had to create in order to enable that experience. But if you're looking at the pieces of data coming off of that wash machine in this case, 60 pieces of data or more, for which is the water temperature, the cycle that's being run, the energy consumption, the time of day. You could go on and on with the elements of both behavioral data, asset data itself, and then the burgeoning environmental data that we started talking about with the cognitive kitchen. How that comes together and making decisions on what sensors do I put in the product itself? What technology path do I put, my company on? And how am I going to start to manage by design the data for which could be captured and the new use cases enabled, but also the continuous loop of new invention, where I might see that a feature function on my product, in this case a wash machine, is not being used. Now I can make a decision as a marketer. Either I want to promote that new feature function because people aren't using it, and I see that the data is coming in of its use or not, or I can see that I can take cost out of the new product next turn of the crank of what would be released in the marketplace, because I now have seen and learned how it's being used real time by users who are opting in. Of course, the privacy and security all being within the context of the user's control, but that information and insight coming back into the company in a 360 point of view for the next design and in iteration of that product evolution. We call that core, capture, optimize, revamp in the engineering, and expand or extend my use cases into the new experience. It goes on to a very specific and unique relationship of that individual product into any industry. So I would posture the electronics industry, we're in all 12 of IBM's industries, where these devices show up into an ATM, into a bank, where they show up into a car, as I was talking about, or into health and well-being and many others. And it's really a challenge for manufacturers in the quote unquote electronics business, but it's a great opportunity to reinvent their business in this digital transformation, digital reinvention path.
So where do we find electronics companies in general on average on their transition toward digital reinvention, or are they stuck at digitization? Because it seems like many of them are still trying to figure out what to do with the data that's collected. They're not necessarily engineering the collection of data or the development of these assets with digital reinvention in mind.
So when we examined this, we created this sort of structure around three groups. There's people who are aspirational, and they represent about a third of the population. So those aspirationals are people who have this great strategic vision, but haven't necessarily figured out how to get it funded or how to move forward. There's another group, which we call, which are tacticians. And these are people who've said, we're going to censor everything. So then they end up with the data tsunami sitting at their door, and they're facing it with buckets. So, and they're close to 40% of that group. And then in this back group, you have this group called the reinventors. And those reinventors, about 20% of the population, are the group that has specifically figured out what to do with that data and how to move forward with using it, not just at the transformation layer, but at the reinvention layer. And what they're doing is being able to reshape that entire value equation to deal with the complexity they have, to deal with the types of data they have, and to understand and interrogate the universe at large to create new means of interaction. So I'd say that we are fairly early on, but we do have really great examples of people who are, in fact, in that process and moving forward. Reza has one of those examples that just every time I hear it continues to surprise me in terms of creating that new interaction.
It's interesting because oftentimes we intuitively equate digital reinvention with creating new sources of revenue. Changing the business model means, okay, now we're generating data, let's go sell it to somebody or somehow generate value from that data. That's not the only way to think about digital reinvention. So digital reinvention could also significantly impact the cost structure. And I'll give you an example. So on the lower end of electronic product, there's a company that we would all recognize the name. They make low-end electronics, sort of mice, keyboards, cases, accessories that attach to computers and mobile devices and so forth. And this is a company that has a fairly large fixed cost base. They spend somewhere in the hundreds of millions of dollars a year in R&D. They have fixed manufacturing capabilities in China. They use very expensive design and prototyping software and labs. They have operations and distribution across the globe that are all sort of fixed costs. If we contrast that with a small company called Studio Neat that also makes similar type of products, right? Small accessories, sort of lower end electronics. Studio Neat is interesting because it has two employees, the two founders. Last time I spoke with them, somewhere in the order of tens of millions of dollars of revenue. Their process is completely different. They've completely reinvented the cost structure, right? So they use an iPad app called Paper to sort of do the original product sketch. They then use a cloud-based CAD software called Rhinoceros. Then they go to a 3D printing company that 3D prints their prototype. So rather than having sort of a fixed labs and so forth, they basically leverage a 3D printing software to do that. What they do is they use Kickstarter as a way of validating, not just validating their idea. So I think we often think about Kickstarter as, oh, okay, that's a crowd, crowdfunding. What these guys do is they use that to validate their product concept, because as you know, in Kickstarter, whoever funds the idea is also committing to buy the product once it's developed. But they also sell the first 1,000 units through Kickstarter. So this is before they've manufactured anything. They've already sold 1,000 units. Then they use a small batch manufacturer called Protomold that manufactures, in small batches. And then they use Shipwire for drop shipping. So with two people, they've essentially created the same business as the full service electronics manufacturer at a much, much lower cost base, but they're able to totally disrupt that model. So let's think about digital reinvention, not just about creating new revenue sources, but it's also a way to completely rethink the cost structure as these guys at Studio Need have done.
Since I'm more of an operations guy and look things more tactically, they're using Shipwise for drop shipping, and they're using Protomold. What happens if they hit a home run and they get something where it's better to manufacture in China, and then they have to deal with all those logistics? So I guess what I'm looking for, Reza, is what's the next step for these guys when they do start to create something that does really well for them?
IBM, of course, has a broad range of clients, right? So many of our clients are, more traditional manufacturers. So this question often comes up and says, look, hey, I just make, let's say wiring and antennas for cell phone towers. I'm very different from Google, right? So how does this reinvention, relate to me? And the reason I think this example is really hard hitting is, if you think about it, this is the way that sort of traditional manufacturing portion of the electronics industry can get disrupted. But what these guys have done is created basically an innovation engine that's running at a fraction of a cost, as a traditional, R&D type operation would. They're validating a product design. They're validating the market opportunity. The question is, okay, what if you hit a home run and now all of a sudden you need to, manufacture millions of units of that product? Well, there's a fairly simple solution to that. You just go to a larger contract manufacturer and say, hey, look, I want to manufacture a much larger number of units for that particular product. But that still leaves you with a much more effective and cost-effective innovation engine that allows them to test and refine new product ideas, bring them to market, at lower units. And then, of course, if they hit a home run, there are many options available to them if they need to scale that business and manufacture larger units.
I love the design aspect of it and getting the new product out the front door. And then if they hit the home run, then the cost will get absorbed in the rest of the operations as they continue to ship that.
One important aspect of companies that successfully reinvent is around decapitalization. I think the challenge with capitalization is the benefit of capitalization, of course, is that, you get economies of scale. If you have your own manufacturing facility, once you amortize that, then you can produce goods much more efficiently. The downside of that, it makes you much less agile, right? If you now all of a sudden need to manufacture something completely different, or if you get into a new, other business, now all of a sudden you've got all this fixed cost tied up. So I think that's one of the most challenging equations for companies to balance is, to what extent do I decapitalize my business in order to buy agility, right? And because I think that's a really important trait for companies that are digitally reinventing themselves.
Reza, on that one, we would all relate to a brand that we see in the U.S. and it's global. It's Vizio televisions, right, which came out of nowhere a few years back, that completely disrupted and took major share away from Sony and Panasonic and the incumbents, where they had a couple hundred people down in the San Diego area, right, engineering and design, within the ability to move agile, as you just mentioned, with the next wave of design, smart TV, new feature functions, et cetera, and pivot quickly on the marketplace, by not having the incumbent heavy structure capitalization for which you have to protect and maneuver. I think from the very small example of Kickstarters to something in between, where you've got company strategy with a couple hundred people on the whole outsourcing, or let's say agility model associated with next generation design and capabilities for which, they can create a whole new wedge in the marketplace, to then the bigger companies being able to adopt an agile posture and perspective. I think that's the landscape we see before us, and we see just radical innovation and disruption happening across the spectrum of products because of the new blurring of lines and all that we were talking about earlier. So it's almost like we see a continuum of that new innovation in digital reinvention from small to large.
For the audience, if you would like to find out more about NextCurve's point of view on this and other digital topics of the day, go to our website, www.next-curve.com, and you'll find research notes, media, and replays of this and other webinars on our site. And to keep up to date with all the great stuff that we're doing here at NextCurve, follow us on our website by subscribing. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and friend us on Twitter to get live feeds and coverage of industry conferences that we attend and special NextCurve events. If you would like to find out more about the IBM Institute of Business Value, go to the subsite on IBM.com. Just scan the QR code. Christine and team have some great research that they have been working on various digital topics impacting the electronics industry. Don't forget to check out our webcast with IBM on the future of cloud, the cloud continuum. It is available for replay on our Rethink Media channel on the NextCurve website.
Clearly, we have talked about what we're doing on data economy, and that is something we are all excited about. But we have a fantastic and deep report talking about adoption and what it takes to reinvent with IoT. And I'll give you just a quick little piece there, and that's IoT plus AI is not additive, it's exponential. We also have a new report, as I just mentioned, on the supply chain and reinventing the supply chain when you can't deal with changes to your ERP system, how you might want to examine new ways of working around that using blockchain, AI, and other new technologies. We have another report on cloud, which is navigating the cloud continuum. As Leonard mentioned, the report that accompanies that podcast actually goes into kind of these 8 use cases that are fundamental to creating that change. And there are 7 other ones out there for you available. And we would love to have you take a look, provide feedback, and tell us what you would like us to talk about in kind of the next conversation that we are privileged enough to share with our NextCurve colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so if you would like to get in contact with NextCurve, just contact me, Leonard Lee. If you would like to contact the IBV and IBM, your point person is going to be Christine, and her information is provided there. So with that, thank you everyone for attending. Have a wonderful day.